Hi guys, it's Tamara coming back at you with another video. Welcome back to my channel. My lighting, let me just start with that. It's a little bit different, this video, for a very important reason. I have a terrible migraine headache, so I figured, that I would get some filming done today, but that I would keep the top lights off and just try my best to deliver a good video to you today. I want to bring up some things that have a lot to do with recent political events in our society. And I think that this is important for us to pay attention to now more than ever. So I'm going to be talking about trauma. And trauma is my specialization. It's my certifications. I have certifications, international certifications in compassion fatigue, family trauma, and child and adolescent trauma, as well as clinical trauma. And they all have different levels of importance and skill associated with each of those certifications. So maybe one day I will do a video where I talk a little bit more about the certifications and kind of what they mean and why I pursued each one. But for the purposes of this video and the benefits to you are, and I'm going to put them over here still, that the benefits for you is that you're going to be able to define trauma. You're going to have a little bit more of a broad understanding of what trauma is. And I think that's important considering the recent traumatic events that we have had. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump right on in. I do have my notes as I typically keep with me, and this kind of helps me keep you guys focused, but also touch on the major points that need to be talked about. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm going to start with what is trauma. So when I was beginning as a clinician about 9 years ago, I had no idea what trauma was. I thought trauma was this big major thing that needed to happen in your life, like, war and going off to battle. And, I thought PTSD was only for people who were sexually assaulted and for people who sustained injuries as a result of like fires. And, I always viewed trauma conceptually as this major thing that had to happen. And if that didn't happen in your life, you certainly didn't need to be labeled as traumatized. But the further along I went in my career and in my training, I realized that that wasn't true. I realized that trauma can be defined as one single event that outweighs your capacity or your ability to cope with it. So basically what that means is that it's one incident that could be high intensity, or it's one incident that could be, or it's an incident that could be high frequency. So I'm going to put that over here for you so you can follow me. So let me repeat that for you guys. So trauma could be any situation that outweighs your ability to cope with it. It could also be a situation that's high intensity, right, and low frequency, or it could be a situation that's high frequency but low intensity and it's repeated. So an example of the first one, high intensity but low frequency, could be a car crash. It could be going off to war. It could be a fire, a house explosion, right? That's a situation that's high intensity. It's major, but the frequency of it was one time. And so therefore, I'm traumatized because it was major, but it only occurred one time. So that could be an example of one side of trauma. The other side of trauma could be low intensity and high frequency. So child abuse, right? That could be, high frequency, getting beat every day, getting called names every day, being sexually abused every day, right? Or it could be something such as being bullied every day, and it just adds up and it builds until you can't tolerate it anymore. So that's an example of another portion of trauma. The way that I want you to think about trauma is I like to define it as one heartbeat skip, right? One heartbeat skip after the other, right? It's like, it's a situation that causes you to stop breathing for a second, right? After the other, one after the other, after the other. And it's just difficult to deal with. So when you hear the term trauma, I want you to think about the fact that trauma can be defined in multiple ways for any individual. So it's not up to us to kind of say, well, that wasn't really traumatizing. Well, maybe it was for that person, right? High frequency or high intensity, or high frequency and low intensity, whatever the case would be or might be, it's traumatizing. Now, there are a couple of things that I want you to think about when we discuss trauma. One is that it's a full body effect, that it's not just the mind and the psychology associated with trauma. There's also physiological components and emotional components. And I'm going to go a little bit through those for you today. And then I want to talk just a bit about the challenges with immigration that we're dealing with and the effects of that trauma on kids. So when we think of, let me fix my camera, guys. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, I feel like my camera's like slowly sliding. But let's go ahead and talk just a little bit about this full body effect of trauma, okay? So let's start top down. That's how we'll do that. So we'll start with the brain. When someone is being traumatized, we are looking at a cascade of negative neurological effects, okay? And we're looking at anatomical or actual changes of the brain. Some research suggests that there are effects to what is called the hippocampus and the amygdala, as well as the frontal lobes. And I'm going to try to post some pictures around me, so keep your eyes on the screen, because I want to show you what the hippocampus looks like, I want to show you what the frontal lobes look like, and I want to show you what the amygdala looks like. The amygdala is kind of like this heart-shaped little kidney bean in the middle of the brain. And basically, I like to call that the emotion center of who we are as people. That's where we store emotional memories. We also store memories, olfactory memories, right? So we smell something and hey, that triggers a thought, right? Or we see something and we're like, wait a minute, I saw that once before, those kind of memories are in the amygdala, right? All of those memories where there's good emotions attached, but also where there's bad emotions attached. And that's what makes recovery from trauma so difficult, is that there are actual brain changes that happen when someone is traumatized. And it's basically happening all in the amygdala, but there's other parts of the brain as well. But for the purposes of keeping this video short and succinct and very basic and simplified, I want you to keep your mind on three important parts of the brain, which is the amygdala, the frontal lobes, and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a little small part of the brain as well. I'm going to try to post a picture somewhere around me. It's a little small part of the brain that has a lot to do with memory. And while the amygdala takes on emotional memory, the hippocampus takes on another portion of memory. So those two guys work together to make up emotional memories and being able to recall things from our history, being able to store memory, right? Then we also have the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes are on the front of the forehead, right in the back part. And the frontal lobes are basically, I like to call the seat of our personality. It's where our personality is based, right? It's also where we make decisions. It's also impulse control. So if you think of somebody who's been traumatized, it's really, really hard for them to, I'm sorry guys, my camera makes that like alert sound. So I'm really sorry, I need to turn those notifications off. But the frontal lobes, when you think of somebody who's traumatized, think of someone who has a hard time paying attention, a hard time bringing things back to memory, a hard time coping emotionally with memory, a hard time processing things because of poor decision making or poor attention span or impulsivity. All of those reactions and behavior are the result of trauma. It's what trauma has done to the brain. Okay, so keep those things in mind. I might come back with another video. We'll see. No promises there. But I might come back with another video that talks a little bit more about the brain and some of the changes that happen, because there are way more complex pieces of the brain that is affected by trauma, but I wanted to make it very simple. Let's talk about the physiological pieces of trauma. Okay, the physiological pieces of trauma is this. When you are stressed and you are overwhelmed and you are dealing with a traumatic situation, or a situation that your mind and your body doesn't have the capacity to tolerate, we are also dealing with chemicals from the pineal gland. Okay, the pineal gland is this little pea-sized gland in the middle of your brain, right? So basically at the tip or the top of your head, right? And what it does is it secretes fluid, and that fluid is called cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone, okay? It's a hormone that increases in the body when you are stressed. When you are stressed, cortisol gets released throughout the body, and it creates a cascade and a variety of processes that happens in your body. It can cause, tense muscles and tight muscles. It can cause poor sleep patterns. It can cause, just a variety of other things that I don't want to get too far into. But the body is stressed, okay? When someone is being repeatedly traumatized, I think it's important to keep in mind that cortisol is being released. And if it's being released repeatedly, even when nothing is happening, the body is responding as if something is happening. That is basically the definition of trauma, right? The event has passed, right? It's in the past, it's back there. We don't need to focus on it. And yet our body is still reacting as if the trauma is still here or still remains. So cortisol is the result of that, in addition to a bunch of other things. But cortisol is mainly the result of the body reacting as if it is still within that traumatic event. Okay, so now that we have the physiology and the biology aside, let's focus on environment. Okay, so when we think of trauma in terms of environment, I want you to think of two things: risk factors and protective factors. I'm going to put them here. Risk factors, protective factors. I think it's important to keep in mind. Why? Because risk factors are things that happen in our lives that makes us more vulnerable to defeat. It makes us more vulnerable to problematic behaviors, attitudes, lifestyles, coping skills, the list goes on. Protective factors make us less vulnerable to those negative things. So risk factors would be things like growing up in a substance abusing family, being given up for adoption multiple times and going to multiple households and foster homes, failing in school and feeling like a failure, low self-esteem and bullying, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, a parent who's emotionally detached, right? So when we add all those things up on the risk factor side, okay, we're making ourselves, or maybe I shouldn't say we're making ourselves, but our environment is making us more vulnerable to not succeeding in life. When we look at the protective factor side of everything, right? Educated parents, if there's a single parent household, that parent is constantly available. Higher income, higher socioeconomic status, access to supportive family members, access to a better educational system, right? All of those protective factors, all those things that kind of cocoon and pull in you as an individual, kind of makes you less vulnerable to the effects of things such as trauma. All right, so that's environment. Last but not least, I know there's something else I wanted to mention in here as well. I think we also need to keep in mind, and I'm going to link that right up here for you guys. We also need to keep in mind intergenerational trauma. That trauma can happen throughout the lifespan, and it can make us 10 times more vulnerable for future traumatic events. And I'm going to link that video so that you can see in that video exactly what I'm talking about there. But what I'm talking about is intergenerational trauma and how it affects us, how it affects our family members throughout the lifespan. So I really think that when we're dealing with trauma in a general sense, we have to also look at the fact that, wait a minute, has trauma happened in the past? And if it did, how did we deal with it? What happened? What were the results? The other thing is post-traumatic stress disorder. When the body feels like it is constantly in that stressful mode, and it's not being threatened by anything, PTSD is likely to result. Cortisol is the result of the body going through changes, right? Fight or flight. And so PTSD is likely to result. The other thing that I want to throw in there really quickly is traumatic bonding. And I'm also going to link those videos up here as well, because I did do a video series on traumatic bonding. So all of these things are important when we're talking about the general topic of trauma. All right, guys, so let me really briefly mention some things about the immigration laws and some of the things that we're dealing with. So about 2,000 immigrant children were sent to a place of confinement where they could be shipped, for lack of a better word, back overseas. And the images and the news reports, some of the word of mouth I've gotten from clients who are connected to some of those families, it is heartbreaking to say the least. And my heart breaks for those kids. They are not only dealing with the potential for trauma, but they are also dealing with the potential for feeling abandoned, discriminated against, socially ostracized, abused, neglected. These poor kids are going to have a tough time if they don't have supportive family members, if they don't have access to better resources, if they don't have access to supportive services or opportunities. These kids are going to suffer. Remember those risk factors on this side. Remember those risk factors that we talked about. Do they have any of these factors to keep them and hold them and cocoon them and bring them in and say, it's okay that you're going through this, but you have this instead, right? So as a child, adolescent, and family therapist, I'm extraordinarily burdened. My heart is burdened by all of this for the simple fact that I honestly cannot believe that we have come to this place in our nation where we care nothing about the future of our kids. So I think it's important to keep in mind as we end this video on trauma. It's important we keep our mind focused on the fact that these are kids who are like American kids. These are kids who are like Canadian kids. These are kids who are like Australian kids, right? These are kids who want a future. These are kids who were brought here by their parents. They had no decision or no forethought or no decision-making power in the matter. They just came with their parents. They trusted their supervision, and now they are being segregated from them. And I'm sure their question is, but why? And so these kids are going to be hurt. So we definitely have to keep in mind that trauma is likely to result, and how are we going to deal with it? And so in the next video, guys, I want to talk a little bit more about this. I want to give some facts, but then in addition to the facts, I also want to engage you guys in looking at some of the research on childhood and adult trauma. And then I also want to give you the opportunity to help these kids by bringing in some resources and maybe letting your voice be heard a little bit more than it is. All right, guys, so thank you so much. Oh God, I hate when that happens. I'm so sorry. That's my camera notification again. But I was saying, thank you so much, guys, for being with me today. Please give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful to you. I hope that you were able to think through some of this and get some benefit. I know it's a little bit longer than it typically is. But there's a lot to say about trauma, that's for sure. But if you found this video helpful to you, I encourage you to give it a thumbs up. And I also encourage you to hit the subscribe button here on the side. That way, when I post new videos, you'll gain access to it. All right, guys, thanks so much. And I will see you really soon with the next topic. Bye.